Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight to the Brenham Heritage Museum. We have a distinguished guest, Dr. Paul Spellman, who is a seasoned author, speaker, and historian who retired after 30 years of teaching at the college level, including 25 years at Wharton County Junior College. He holds degrees from Southwestern University, Texas A&M, Corpus Christi, the University of Texas at Austin, and earned his PhD from the University of Houston. He's going to be giving a talk tonight about the Old 300, and the title is The Old 300, Who Were They Really? And I thought that was an interesting title, so I'm interested in hearing what he has to say. So everyone please give a warm welcome to Dr. Paul Spellman.
Thank you. I've never had a warm-up act before. That's great. And what was the guy's name? Nestor? What was the last name?
Nestor Cassius Clay.
Clay?
Clay.
What's his last name?
Got here in 1821.
That's Finney Clay.
I'm Finney Clay.
Nice to meet you.
Finney,
I like that
a whole other
stuff.
story.
Okay. All right. That's pretty interesting. All right. Good evening. Nice to see everyone here. Thanks for coming, and thanks for the invitation. Thank you, Sierra, for inviting me to come be with you this evening. It is really nice, I must say. I'll try to move around a little bit around these brick walls here. It's really nice to speak to a group who knows what I'm talking about. And I say that because there have been a couple of occasions since I wrote this book where I've been asked to come speak, and 3 or 4 or 5 minutes into my little talk, 2 or 3 hands go up in the air and they go, "What is the Old 300? And so we back up a little and take a running start at it and do that kind of thing. And so I know this group knows who they are, at least about them, because again, this is the heart of Old 300 country, right here where we stand. And it just feels, sometimes you can feel the ghosts and the spirits of those folks who came to be a part of this in the early 1820s. So I want to talk a little bit first. Well, first, if you'll permit me, a quick commercial. The museum was very kind to let me know that they have some, that they keep copies of my book, The Old 300, although we're about out, apparently. So we are going to be able to, if you're interested, take orders for Old 300 books, and I will get them here as quickly as I can for you. But they also ordered 2 other of my books, which they're selling upstairs after the program. And I just want to say a quick word about each of those books, and then we'll get into the other stuff. This one is called The Murder of William Marsh Rice, a Galveston Storm novel. William Marsh Rice, you may know the name as in Rice University. He was a New Yorker and a philanthropist, and had set aside over $100,000 in his will to go to begin an educational institute, which became Rice University. But before that was able to happen naturally, he was murdered in his apartment by the butler. The butler did it. So, I was actually doing some research on Rice himself for another project that I was working on, and I came across the investigation that followed his murder, which included the Baker lawyers from Houston up in New York doing part of that investigation. And I also, as I was working on that, it just registered with me that his murder took place on September 22nd of 1900. That's 14 days after the Galveston storm. And at the moment, as I was working on some other things, I stopped and said, well, there's a story here somewhere. I mean, you got a hurricane, you got a murder, you got the butler, you got the investigation. And so that's how all that came together. So I wrote this historical novel about the murder of William Marsh Rice. I also wrote it in the first person of a fictional Pinkerton detective who witnesses and experiences the Galveston storm and is part of the investigation of the Rice murder. So if you have interest in that, we have some copies upstairs. I'll be glad to sign for you this evening if you would like to do that. The other book is old and new. It's called The Lost Treasure of Buffalo Gap. You may know the little town of Buffalo Gap up near Abilene. I was up there many years ago working on a project, again, to create what became the historic village that's there now. And I learned a lot about what was going on around there, and they were trying to get a little publishing company going. And so they asked me if I'd be interested in writing something related to Buffalo Gap, and that they would then publish that and kind of get a start, if you will, on their project. So I did. I came home and I wrote this book, The Lost Treasure of Buffalo Gap, which is really aimed at teenagers, young preteens and teenagers, but it's also a great family book. And anyway, I wrote it and I sent it up there to the little publishing company, and they promptly shut down. I don't think it was my fault, but there I sat and with this manuscript and nobody really interested in publishing it. And so last year, I decided, I'm now retired, I've got some other book projects I've been working on. I pulled it back up and I edited it and worked on it a little bit and just published it myself. So that's The Lost Treasure of Buffalo Gap. We have grandkids that age, between like 11 and 14 or 15. Maybe they'd like to read something besides Marvel comics and dragons and sorcerers and whatever they read these days. Anyway, if you're interested in that one, we have some copies of that upstairs as well. But I'm here to talk about the old 300, Stephen F. Austin's families that he brought down and signed contracts as part of a colonization law that was worked up with the brand new Mexican government after the Spanish had left, and you know that part of the story. And I want to take a little running start, if you will, about how I came to write the book and what that was like. Some of you are writers and authors or wannabes, and I hope if you are thinking about writing stuff, like family stuff, I hope you really do that. It's really important for us to all have those kinds of stories and remembrances of families in our early history. And then tell you a little bit about what I learned about the old 300, having taught it. And I taught it when I was a 4th grade teacher. I taught it when I was a 7th grade teacher. I taught it when I was an 11th grade teacher. And I taught it in junior college for 2 decades and one of the universities. And I learned a lot about the old 300 even after I had been teaching it for almost 30 years. And I want to share some of those things with you as well. But when I was getting ready, I just finished working on a small little project with Arcadia. You know the Arcadia, those little brown picture books of counties and cities around that you find at like Walgreens. I just finished one about Horton and was looking for a project, and I'm a member of the old 300. Anyone here member of the old 300 organization? Okay, good, wonderful. All right, there's always a few, and that's wonderful. I'm a member there through the Woods family, Zadok Woods, Zadok and Minerva Woods. So I've been attending and speaking at the group for a number of years, and they had just published a book about the old 300. And what they had done is they'd asked families, the descendants, to send them information about their family and their descendant, their ancestor, and then they compiled it in the book. It was actually their second book. The first would contain 73 of the old 300, and the second one contained 111 of the old 300. And I got to thinking, you know, that's wonderful, but maybe we should have a book that, you know, has all 300 of them in that. It's the old 300. And so I was talking to my wife Kathleen about that, and I said, I'm interested in doing it, but that's going to be a big project. 300 families from 200 years ago. To do that kind of research, I'm a historian, I'm not a genealogist. God bless genealogists to help us historians get along. But I thought, oh my goodness, that's going to be a monumental project, and I wasn't quite sure I wanted to get into it. And you know how this goes. Kathleen stared at me for a minute and said, well, if you're not going to do it, who is? Okay, so now I'm shamed into working on the project. And so I said, okay, I'll tell you, this was in May. I said, I'll take the summer and I'll dig in, and by August, I'll decide whether I want to continue. Well, you know how that goes. By the time you're that far in, you just don't want to stop. And so I worked 2.5 years on the research and about 1.5 years on the writing, much longer than I do on my other books, because again, this is a compendium on the one hand, but I didn't want to make it an encyclopedia, just alphabetize the 300 families. I wanted to make it a story. I wanted a narrative to tell the story of the old 300 and let them tell the story. Okay, their stories, their remembrances, their memories, and let them tell the story and work that through the 300 families. But I also committed to making sure there's something in there of all 300. And the list I use is the list from the 1897 Historical Quarterly, which is the list they use at the General Land Office in Austin. And I have that list, and I started working. At one point, the manuscript was nearly 800 pages long. Even I were not going to buy that. And so I thought, well, okay, how do you pare this down and still include the great, fabulous stories and all 300? And that's not easy to do. But I worked on that, and I got it down to a reasonable 450 pages and felt pretty comfortable about doing that. One of the things that helped me decide how to pare it down was a starting and a finishing place. If you're going to talk about families coming in the 1820s, then you're going to find information, as some of you do. You can trace your family back to the 1600s and the 1500s, 1200s, or wherever. If I started doing that, and I was starting to do that, that's a lot of pages to get to where I really wanted to be. And then where do you stop? Well, the stopping place was kind of easy. The stopping place is when the last of the 300 land grants is signed, which was the summer of 1825. That's a good stopping place, okay? I knew about stuff that happened after that, but I'll let somebody else do volume 2, okay, about what happened to them afterwards. But the summer of 25, when the last 5 or 6 grants are actually signed, was a nice stopping place. And oh, by the way, one of the things I learned, this isn't really rocket science, but one of the things that registered with me as I was working at the General Land Office with those folks was that when the 300th family walked into the office at San Felipe and signed their land grant, just outside the door was number 301 and 302 and 303 right behind him in line, right there in town, ready to sign the grants as well. So it's not just 300 that arrived. They're coming in bunches, and they came by the hundreds. But the original contract with Stephen F. Austin and the Mexican government was for 300. So that was the cutoff, even though there's still people, right outside there who still got land grants, who still got deeds, but are not part of the original 300. And I must say that there have been some times, maybe I'll talk to the Clay family here, when people have come to me and said, my family was in the old 300. And I've asked the name, and they've told me the name, and I'm thinking, no, it's not on the list that I've been using out of the General Land Office, but we came. We were here in 1825. Well, you're part of the second 300, or the old 600, or whatever, okay? And I'm not going to write about that. So, but I get that a lot, and that's great. The fact that they are just streaming in, even as the last number 300 is signed and sealed, is one of the things that I discovered as well. As far as the starting point, again, I had gone all the way back. There were at least 5 of the old 300 who fought in the Revolutionary War, 40 years earlier, which meant they came to Texas in their 60s or 70s with kids and grandkids along the way. So that was a place I could start, or you can just go back wherever. And then as I'm looking back into the story, and many of you know this story as well, in November of 1811, And again, about 10 weeks later, in early 1812, there were two massive earthquakes right in the middle of the Mississippi River Valley, the New Madrid earthquakes. Right? It turned the Mississippi River upside down. It turned lakes into prairies. It turned prairies into lakes. And it destroyed towns. It's called the New Madrid because the town of New Madrid disappeared in the earthquake. Right? And it was felt all the way to the East Coast. There were reports in newspapers of feeling the tremors in Maryland and in Pennsylvania and in South Carolina. And I'm thinking that means a whole lot of these families would have some experience with the earthquake, one way or another. Some of them were right literally where it happened, like the Dyer family in Western Tennessee, and my family in Missouri. But others were 500 miles away or 1,000 miles away, and they still would have a common story when they came together in the neighborhoods of Texas. And so that seemed like a good starting place for the story, not just because it would be a common ground that they might have, but an earthquake. If you're gonna start a book, you can start it with an earthquake. I mean, you know, that's really good stuff. And so that's where it starts. I start in 1811 and then bring the families along, and then the Moses and Stephen off the story and into then telling about the comments. So that's how that sort of came to be. And again, began to continue to work on it. And some of the families, you know, real honestly, are really easy to find. I mean, you got the Fulshers, and you got the Fosters, and you got, you know, a lot of those families who have lots and lots of history and made huge contributions. You know, the Gross family and so on up here. And there's plenty about them. The Kirkendall family, for example. The Kirkendalls are still all over the place, you know. It's a huge family. And they wrote 2 or 3 volumes of their own family story, which is a great resource. And I must say, and I talked to several of the Kirkendalls along the way, you know, when you want to tell a family story, it may or may not be, you know, factual. You know how families tell stories. My family tells those kinds of stories, which may have a little grain of truth in them, but then over the time, you just tell them and they get better. And so I had to make that kind of decision. Do I want to put those kind of stories in here? And my thought was, absolutely. Absolutely, okay? If some formal historian wants to criticize me for putting in stories like that, fine. It's a good read, let me tell you. And those stories enliven the overall narrative that's going on as well. And so, speaking of the Kirkendalls, I know a lot of you have been or often go maybe to Blanco, right, in the New Country. Right there on the town square is a wonderful barbecue place called the Old 300. And I heard about that, and so I drove there when I was working on the book, and I met the 2 young men who started it, a couple of great young Aggies who graduated, and this is what they wanted to do. They wanted to open a barbecue restaurant in Blanco, and then they did. But they didn't know what to call it. And so they were sitting around, as they tell me one day, they were sitting around there working on all of this, and Robert Kirkendall, one of the Kirkendalls, who lives nearby, stopped in and said hey, and I think he knew their parents, and they were just sitting around and they were saying, we don't know what to name our restaurant. And Kirkendall says, why don't you call it the Old 300? I went, God bless you, Robert Kirkendall. Okay, and so they have stacks of my books that they sell there at the restaurant along the way, and great barbecue as well. So again, you know, you got all these little things, little threads all over the place coming together, and hopefully coming together, and so then you begin to work on that and try to make the story cohesive on the one hand, but on the other hand, give it enough breathing space so that it becomes an entertaining story. Okay, again, it's not just about this person and then that person, and then this person and then that person. That would get really dull and boring. And so I just try to infuse some of the, the narrative, some of the anecdotal history into it as well. And boy, there's a lot. There's plenty out there to work with. So that was fun for me, because otherwise, if I had tried to do this as some kind of encyclopedia, it would have not been fun for me, and I probably wouldn't have finished it. But instead, there's nothing alphabetical about it. I guess that's the point. Okay, I talk about it from whole different perspectives during a period of time. Some families I have a little bit more. Some families I have maybe 2 or 3 pages just about that family. Others less so, because again, as you're doing that kind of research, you find as much as you can possibly find. You dig as deep as you can dig. Those of you who write history or anything having to do with history know that if you leave something out that you should have found, someone will always tell you about that. They will always let you know, why didn't you tell this? And my answer would be, well, I didn't know about that. How could you not know about that? It's here, and it's here, and it's here. So when you're doing that kind of work, you look there, and there, and there. And you find everything you can find, so that ultimately at the end, my theory in my writing is, if I didn't find it, I don't think anybody else can. Now there's always exceptions to that. I wrote a biography of Captain John Rogers, Texas Ranger back at the turn of the century. And after I had written it and done all the research, I really enjoyed putting that together. Even talked with some of his family members who live in San Antonio. A year or two after I had published it, after A&M published it for me, I learned from an attorney in Laredo who had cleaned out a building to turn it into his law office, and had found an old file cabinet just leaning in the corner of this abandoned building. And in it were files from a legal office that had been there 100 years earlier. And the files were just laying in there. And in that file was a letter from Mrs. Rogers explaining the moments when her husband died in her arms at the hospital in Waco. I didn't have that. Okay. But maybe I have a pretty good excuse. I wasn't in Laredo changing out a building and finding, a file cabinet in the corner. Anyway, so the amount of information kind of depended again on just how much was already out there for me and how much I could dig up along the way. One of the hardest parts for me was dealing with, as you were talking about before, the single young men. Especially if their names are Smith, John Smith, Robert Smith, Williams was another name, John Williams, Robert Williams. There's a lot of them, okay, in that same generation, right? And very little information about them. I mean, stuff I could find for some of them in the land grant itself, but the land grant doesn't do a lot of resume stuff with it. It just says, this is the person, this is the land grant, this is the information, this is where the land is going to be. And as you were saying earlier, and I really appreciate your telling that story, Stephen F. Austin chose to discourage single young men from signing up for fairly obvious reasons. Single young men out on their own with those young daughters around and, all that kind of stuff. They were trouble. And so he discouraged them by saying, if you come, you're only getting 177 acres, which is not trivial, but compared to the family that has 4,600 acres, that's a big deal, right? And the other group that he discouraged from coming, 2 other groups. One was the preachers. Those preachers, they rile people up. And we don't need people riled up. Not right now and not ever. And so it'll be 1828 before the first preachers actually come into Texas and part of the colony, and they kind of snuck in. A Baptist and a Presbyterian and a Methodist. And they kind of snuck in Austin wasn't thrilled, but you know, that's part of that kind of deal. And the third group that was discouraged were people with criminal records. Okay? Again, the risk that you take if you allow someone in who has a criminal record is a risk that Stephen F. Austin was not interested in taking. And so therefore, you had to show some kind of evidence of some sort, and I don't ever know exactly what it all was, but some kind of evidence of some sort that you did not have any criminal record, that you were not on the lam and leaving the United States so you could find safety in Austin's colony. And a little bit of word of mouth and reading the newspapers, you know, Austin and his staff could probably find out information one way or another. So that was the word from the beginning. If you have a criminal record, criminal background, or you're on the lam from the law, don't bother coming, okay? Don't bother coming. Well, 5 of the old 300 came with criminal records or on the lam. You know, they're criminals, so are they going to really obey that rule as well? I mean, no, they're not going to obey that one either. And so they came. They just didn't bother telling anybody that, oh yeah, I have a criminal record, or I'm on the lam, or whatever. They just came in, said, no, I'm fine, I don't have any criminal record, and they got land grants. So 5 of the old 300 actually have criminal records. 2 of them were, in fact, on the lam and hiding out in Austin's colony. And over the next couple of years, you know, Austin's pretty busy during this period of time. Lots of things going on, but over a period of time, he learned about those 5 who had come in against his will. Right? And he took the time to ride to each of their farms and tell them they had to leave. Okay? And 3 of them left. And the other 2 stayed. Again, I mean, you know, they not obeying one rule or any other one. And those 2 who stayed, by the way, became very good, honest citizens. One of them, Fitzgerald, was one of the founders of Richmond, which is where I live. And, you know, so they made the transition, they made the change, they cleaned up their life or whatever, but they stayed along the way. So those are the groups that were generally discouraged from coming. But back to those single young men. And you were touching on this, and I appreciate you telling that story, because I'm going to use that later. And I may have footnote you and I may not, we'll see. But here's the deal. This is what I found. There were actually 78 young single men in the old 300. A quarter of the old 300. We think of the old 300, don't we? Of Ma and Pa and 11 kids, right? And a big wagon and some mules, and they come all in one big caravan like Daniel Boone leading them through the forests. Not at all. Stephen F. Austin personally brought 12 families with him into his colony, 12. All the rest came on their own, in different sized groups, in every direction, by land, by sea, from all over the place, and I'll tell some more of that as well. But the single young men thing, again, 78 on the old 300 list. And as I began to look at that list, I realized that that actually comprised 39 partnerships. Because the loophole in the deal was that if you had a business partnership, you came in as a family, so you would be eligible for the 4,600 acres. So the word got out. So the scenario would be something like this, and I like yours also about going back to Kentucky, trying to get somebody to come with you, okay? But for me, what I found several times when I could actually find them, some of them were for New Orleans. So, you know, the scenario is like, this guy is sitting there at the beer joint with his buddy, and he's saying, I'm gonna go to Texas. And was there, I wanna just get a fresh start in life, I'm going to Texas. And his buddy goes, well, yeah, fine, you go, I'm not interested. But he said, no, wait a minute, I need a partnership so that when I go there, I can get the full 4,600 acres. So I'd like for you to be my partner. And, you know, sign here that we're a partnership. And the other guy goes, I don't want to go to Texas. Yeah, but I do, and this is the way I can get around it and get the whole 4,600 acres. And the guy goes, yeah, but what's in it for me? I don't know, I'll buy you another beer. Okay, all right, so we got a deal. So that's what happened. So he signs the deal and he goes to San Felipe and he says, my partner and I are here, and where's my partner? Well, he's back in New Orleans getting things ready, and he'll be on the way. So both of those names end up on the deed and in the list of the old 300. And that other guy may or may not ever set foot in Texas. And I found a few of them, but it's hard to find all the ones who did or didn't. But I found a few who did, and I found a few who didn't. And I also found a few that Buddy, after he finished his beer, packed up and came to Texas and was here for about 6 months and went, no, I knew I didn't want to be in Texas. And he turned around and went back to New Orleans. Okay, so again, a whole bunch of names here of people who either never even came to Texas or turned right around and left Texas soon after they had signed a deed. And I think that's fascinating to me because, again, we think of this old 300 as sort of a collective who all came together in one giant community and just all lived happily ever after as neighbors from here all the way down to the coast. And it's anything but that. And another thing that I found, and again, this makes more common sense than I thought it would, but we have this other stereotype that these families came because of the panic, the bankers' panic that was going on in the United States. In 1817, banks began to fail, especially out on the frontier, at the Bank of St. Louis and the Bank of New Orleans and the Bank of Nashville, and people were losing everything. And so by 1819, it is a full-blown economic crisis all across the United States. And 2 years later, people start coming to Texas. So it was a logical conclusion that these folks had lost everything, and so they literally had no place else to go. Or maybe we're going to have liens on their farms or their stores or their businesses that they would never be able to pay, and so they just put the little "Gone to Texas" sign, on the doorknob, which is kind of iconic and maybe happened once or twice, I don't know. And they came to Texas. You kind of had to start over again. Now, there was a fair share of those folks. Even my family, Zadok Woods, had lost his job there in Missouri, not so much because of the panic, but because of the whiskey. Anyway, but he did finally lose just about everything, and so he does, that family does sort of count into that sort of stereotype. You've lost everything, you have no place else to go, let's go to Texas. That is not remotely even the majority of the families. Many of them were doing just fine where they were. And they just, for whatever other reasons, a restlessness, a sense of adventure, a challenge, a dare, whatever it might be, other family kinds of notions. There's, in some ways, there's 300 reasons for the 300 families who came to Texas. Okay? And some of them are very, very personal, and some of them are business related, and everything in between. Okay? And of course, at the far extreme of that was the Gross family, who came wealthy, dozens of wagons, 100 slaves. Gross had a really prosperous cotton plantation in Georgia, and he shut it all down and moved over into Alabama territory and rebuilt it, and then shut it down and moved to Texas and essentially rebuilt it again. And he prospered everywhere he went. Okay? So he hardly fits, that stereotype of the poor and the impoverished and the disenfranchised struggling to Texas. There were some like that, but not as many as we often have thought when we tell the stories. And so that was one of the things I learned as well, that I thought, okay, that's a little bit different. Here's a couple other things. I spoke about the earthquake of 1811, 1812. Shortly after that, the War of 1812 began, and I found at least 20 of these folks who fought in the War of 1812. They would have been about that generation. And in fact, not only that, found about a dozen of them who fought in the same battle, but in different companies. When they went up into Canada in 1813, fought at the Battle of the Thames outside of York. And I found their military records, And I thought to myself, I wonder if they knew each other then, because they came from all over, and they may have fought in the same battle, but it was a pretty large army, and they were in completely different companies, which scattered after that on their march to Montreal. And I just wondered out loud if 10 years later, their neighbors in Texas, and they're getting to know each other, and they ask about their past, and one of them says, well, I was in the war. Oh, I was in the war too. Really? What company you were in? No, I was in so-and-so's company. No, I don't know about that. And, where were you? Well, I fought up there at York. I did too. I don't know that happened, but I just feel that kind of thing would have been one of those commonplace that would have helped build the community. Okay, we were there. Almost all of us felt the earthquake. Okay, have a little story that they can tell each other about that. Here's the other thing I love. We often, and I tell the story myself, talked about how the old 300 essentially came from the Mississippi River Valley, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana. That's where Moses Austin family was from Missouri. So it would have been his group, his people that would have followed him and so on. That's the story we tell. That's just, not true. And it's not true on a couple of different levels. I have the 3-volume letters of the Austin papers, letters that the Austins wrote and business receipts and stuff that were published a long time ago. And they go all the way back to the 1790s and all the way up into the 1820s. And I discovered in there in 1820, when Moses Austin is first thinking about bringing those families down, right? He's on his way to San Antonio to try to work out some kind of deal there with, at the time, the Spanish governor. And he sent the word out, okay? I'm going to go to Texas. I'm going to get back here this next summer, and I want you to sign up. I can bring 300 families. And I found 40 letters of interest by families writing to Moses Austin in late 1819 and the first 6 or 7 months of 1820, even after he had already died. Letters writing to Moses Austin of interest in coming to be a part of that. And not a single one of those families is in the old 300. Not a one. The 40 plus families that Austin was getting together, none of them came. Right? Some because, Moses Austin was dead. And so they didn't want to, they weren't part of that anymore. When they heard that young Stephen was going to pick it up, some of them went, Stephen? I don't think so. He didn't even want to go in the first place, so I don't think I want to go. Others, for lots of different reasons, as you can imagine, bowed out. So, again, the families that came from a brand new, fresh list, if you will, with Stephen F. Austin sending the word out through the newspapers, and people coming and word of mouth and so on along the way. Anyway, we make that assumption then that the Mississippi Valley just picked up and moved to Texas. In fact, in 1824, as all of this is in full momentum, there are 24 states of the Union. That's how I remember 1824, 24 states. There's at least one family in the old 300 from every single state of the Union. Maine, Delaware, Rhode Island, Indiana, Florida, New Jersey, at least one family from every single state of the Union, which creates a whole new kind of base then when you talk about Americans coming to Texas with this colony. This is truly a cross-section of Americans coming to Texas, coming from every region and every state, and making their way one way or another into Texas. Also on the list are people from Ireland and England and Scotland. Not that they are second or third generation. No, they got on a ship from Scotland or England and came to Texas directly. Okay? There's plenty of the Scots-Irish, and there's always a bunch of them around during that period of time. But these are folks, about 6 or 7 families, who came directly from there to Texas and made their way, including an Englishman. And this Englishman actually showed up in Texas in 1818. That's 3 years before the old 300. He came in down here, on the Colorado River. Nobody's around. He liked the lonely life in the woods. He built a cabin. Had a little crop that he would put out every once in a while. And one day people started showing up in the neighborhood and building cabins. And he goes, "Who are you people?" "Oh, we're here with Austin's Colony." "I have no idea what you're talking about." Well, Stephen would tell him the story. And so he traveled up to San Felipe and introduced himself and said, "I've actually been here like 3 years before you got here. Can I join up?" "Sure." So he becomes part of the old 300. Right? So, really interesting kind of things. There were some, you may know about the Battle of Medina. A really enigmatic battle fought south of San Antonio back in 1813, in which a Republican army, a revolutionary army, was absolutely slaughtered by the Spanish army at the Medina River. And they're still looking for the actual battlefield where it took place. But after that battle, the Spanish army continued to march all the way to Nacogdoches, chasing off or killing anybody they came across, thinking any of them might be cohorts of some kind of that revolutionary Republican army that they had just wiped out. And there were 6, if my number's right, 6 of those soldiers in that Republican army who escaped the massacre at Medina and ran for their lives up past Nacogdoches and kept on running all the way into Arkansas and back to their homes where they were from. That was in 1813. They came back to Texas with Austin's Colony. I don't think I would have done that, but they did. I guess as they were running, they're going, "This is not a bad place here, actually. It's kind of nice, River is real pretty here and nice trees, so maybe I'll come back someday." And then they did, okay? Pretty remarkable, it seems to me. Again, really almost nothing to do with Stephen F. Austin. They just knew someday, for whatever reasons, they wanted to come back to Texas, and here was their ticket to get over here. So they came. A couple more things. And again, I just found it personally fascinating that I could identify families from every single state. I mean, that just, to me, was terrific. And again, they came every which way. They came overland. There was an overland trail that took them through Missouri, what is today part of the the Santa Fe Trail. They came that way and then down through what is today eastern Oklahoma, and then came across the Red River and made their way down. There were others who came right across Arkansas and came in where Texarkana is today, and then made their way on down the old Spanish trail. And there are others who were actually living in Nacogdoches who decided that moving down to the Brazos of the Colorado sounded kind of cool. So they'd actually already been living in Texas for a while, and they picked up and came down and joined up as well. There's some who came by sea, either by boat from New Orleans or whatever else kind of craft they might find to make their way along the coast. One of the most famous groups, of course, it's a whole other story, the ship that Stephen F. Austin purchased to bring some settlers who were mostly construction workers and materials to build his new capital at the mouth of the Colorado River. And the ship landed at the mouth of the Brazos, thinking it was the mouth of the Colorado. And they unloaded all the materials, and the ship sailed away. And there they were going, "Where's Stephen F. Austin? He was going to meet us here. Where is he? He's over in the Colorado going, where's my ship? And where's my people? And where are my materials?" "Well, they're unloaded, 40 miles away up the coast." Those are the ones who finally started making their way up the Brazos to see if they could find Stephen F. Austin. And they never found him. What they found was a great big huge bend in the Brazos River. It bends back almost on itself. And so they went back and got the materials and hauled them up to there and built a little warehouse. And they put the materials in there and again waited for Stephen F. Austin to show up, which he never did. And ultimately later people referred to that little warehouse as a fort. In the Benton. Fort Benton. Which is obviously no longer there, except if you've been to Richmond, there is a street called 4th Street that's closed. Right? Goes right down to the river. Anyway. Okay, a couple more things, and then if you have any questions, we got some time for that, and then finish up here. There's two other things I discovered which I thought were absolutely remarkable. One, 7 of the old 300 are women who got deeds in their name. They were all widows. Some of them were widowed on the way to Texas. Their husbands died. And instead of turning around and going back, they pressed on. And a couple of them had kids. They could have gone back to their families and given the whole thing up, but it was the dream that they and their husbands had had, and they kept on and they got here. Stephen F. Austin gave them deeds in their name. And I just think that's obviously way ahead of the time for starters, but the courage and the perseverance of those women to keep coming, okay, to come all the way and finish what they had all started together is a terrific story all unto itself. And then finally, there are 4 of the old 300. And I can promise you that Stephen F. Austin did not know this. I'm the first one who found it. Just say it. But these 4 part of the old 300, and I'm sure their neighbors didn't know this either. Full-blooded Native American Indians. 3 of them are Creek, and 1 is a Cherokee. And the Southern Creek, who lived in the Alabama, Mississippi area, had Americanized themselves. They dressed American, they took on American names, they spoke fluent English, they did everything they could to try to be able to stay in their homeland. And the Northern Creeks came down and wiped them out for having Americanized themselves. And some of the survivors of that massacre decided, we're out of here, and they headed west, and they came to Texas. And they identified themselves by their American name and were granted deeds in the old 300. The other one, the Cherokee, actually ran a sawmill up near Nacogdoches. And nobody there knew that he was full-blooded Cherokee. But he was one of the ones who picked up and made his way down to the colony and identified himself with his American name. You know, they're not going to tell you that. And they were accepted in as part of the old 300. And all of them made real contributions to that colony. So it's just a sort of across-the-board set of discoveries that humanized and personalized this group we just call, the old 300, and who they really were. They comprised almost 1,500 people, wives and children and grandparents that came with them and settled real people in real lives in this part of Texas along the Brazos and the Colorado. So that's who I think they really were. And thank you very much for
Is all this information in the book?
It's all in the book.
Sign me up.
Okay. Sierra? All right. See Sierra.
I have a question.
Sure.
It's based on what I call my surmise. This is my neighbor Tom. Adjacent to his property, there's a thicket that you could not get in with a pack. Adjacent to my property is a thicket you couldn't get in with bulldozer. Okay, so I imagine 1821, they come in, and all of Washington County looks like our adjacent property.
Not just there, but every creek, every bayou
And so,
had that block of those.
So did any of them come and say, what am I going to do with this? It's going to take a lifetime of labor just to clear it. How did that, I mean, I know slavery is the answer, but it's partial, but
No, that's
how
only,
did that-
yeah,
how
that's
does
only
that
part of
happen?
the answer. The other answer is, I'm not going to let this stop me either. And if it takes me 3 months to dig my way through these weeds to get to the creek, I'm gonna take 3 months to do it. And I'm gonna use whatever scythe or whatever I have, and my boys are gonna help me, and we're just gonna make our way through this, and they did. And again, it was on Onion Creek, it was on Buffalo Bayou, and it was on the Lower Colorado, and it was here in Washington County. Every creek, every river lined with these thick, 18-foot high weeds that were 15 feet thick, and they just did it. It just said, we have to get there, so we'll do what we have to do.
How long did it take them? 2, 3 seasons to make it arable?
It depends. I mean, it depends on how many people were working. If you get a whole community together where you got 10 or 12 families, you got 40 or 50 people, you can work on it a lot faster. They were almost all of them in a hurry to get those first crops planted and get that cabin built. So again, you get your neighbor and you introduce yourself and say, come help me. And then they do. And then later, when that neighbor needs something, he comes over and says, hey, come help me. And you know what? Then they do. And that's part of that story as well. Yeah.
Hey, just a comment about your presentation. I think historical evidence says that the terrain in Texas was different at that time. This was really like several inches of the Great Plains. It wasn't an overgrown, gigantic pit like the left to see it out. And the land had been more open at that time. My question
Yeah.
was, how many families came to Texas? 4,600 acres is a lot of land. That's a lot of land. How many came with the intent of becoming the land and becoming wealthy from all this?
So how many came and did something with the 4600? Or?
How many came with that intent? To me, 4,600 acres is just such a tremendous amount of land.
Right.
If I had the opportunity to get that free, my aspiration would be, I am going to become the land generator.
Yeah, well, I think some of them certainly thought that would happen, and a few of them made the most out of that and did that, and others subdivided some of that, sold it off later. Some planted a lot of corn and a lot of other, and later cotton. But you're right also, the first part of your question, there's plenty of open land in all of this, but again, it's across the board kinds of terrain. You go down to Brazoria County, along that coast, and looks a lot like it did 200 years ago, the heavy vegetation down there. You come out here, the farther up the Brazos, the farther up the Colorado, you get into the more of the high plains. There's stories about them shooting buffalo out here, so that's part of that connection as well. Yeah.
Curious, approximately what percentage of those original deeds are still intact with those original family names?
Oh, of the original deeds? I don't know that answer, and I remember asking the General Land Office staff that the other day, a year or so ago, and they weren't quite sure either, but I would guess very tiny percentage. Because again, that second and third generation are happy to sell it off. And the other thing that would happen, of course, and this still happens today as well, is that next generation, the 5 kids, would divvy it up among themselves. And then that family married into this other family, and then that family ended up with that acreage because of the in-law thing. And so, yeah, but I would say, and I really should find that out, that's a great question. I would say a very tiny percentage still intact.
You mentioned the old place where they stored all the lumber that was brought in.
Right.
And that area that was known as Fort Bend, was it near Richmond, the current Richmond, Texas?
It's right at the bridge in downtown Richmond.
And
Right where that highway bridge
there's a
crosses.
huge oxbow right there.
Yep. And at the time, they described the oxbow, it was dry. So the description of it is, there's this whole thing of sand that just, we don't even know where that came from. They said it looked like a big giant sand dune, okay? And boy, I had to scratch my head for a while until I realized it was the oxbow, which, it's mostly full nowadays. But yeah, that's where that was, right there, right where the highway bridge crosses. So if you go to have lunch at Larry's, and you just look down there.
Thank you.
It's generally thought that I mean, there's a cotton economy here, and people bought their slaves
Yes.
to farm the cotton. How many of the old 300 were slave owners?
I don't remember the exact number. I would say probably somewhere in the range of about 75 of them had slaves of some kind. And some of those were, like my family, the Woods family had one slave. His name was Washington. And he came with them from Missouri into Texas, and he was really sort of part of the family. He worked the land with the brothers and the sons, but that was a lot of them had one or two who were as much house servants and workers. But then there were plenty who brought enough to work the fields, and once cotton really started catching on, like Gross with 100 of them. By the way, some of his slaves, up against the stereotype of the day, he trained as architects. And they helped him take down his plantation and rebuild his plantation, not as just construction workers, but as architectural engineers that he had trained to do that. So, yes, sir.
Regarding the slaves, you're saying only 75 of the 300 families had slaves?
That's about right. Yeah, something like that.
Have you researched that deeply?
I have in the appendix to the book, I have a whole chapter about slaves and slavery.
Because I'm on the Brazos River, and everybody had slaves there. It wasn't just them.
Right, but again, you discount most of those single young men who, most of them didn't have slaves, and some of the others who had, got 7 sons, you put them to work pretty well, and might have a few slaves. So the number may be a little low, but I don't think it's like a majority number at all of the 300 families. We have one time, maybe one more question? Yeah, back there.
Was Arabelle Harrington one of the widows of the whole 300?
Harrington,
Harrington.
with an H? No.
Because she owned the land, so originally.
Yes.
And she was a widow when she got there.
Yes, and again, that next group that came in, and then the next group, there were plenty more. These were just some of the first ones who came in, but that set a kind of a precedent for widows to come in and get land in their own name. Yes, sir.
1936, they picked up the families and moved them off to the cemetery. Nestor is on row S, number 11.
Okay.
So who did that, and is there any paperwork involved, and do you know any history of that?
Oh, yeah, the Texas Historic Commission would be glad to help you with that. Okay, all right. Well, let me see if I can think of somebody else you can contact.
All right.
But, yeah, 1936,
Yeah.
Centennial, paid for by New Deal money. It's another story. And a lot of those folks moved over to the cemetery in Austin, which is a beautiful cemetery. All the work they've done to it now, it's gorgeous. I think we're out of time. Thank you all again so much for coming.
Thank you so much for coming. And like Dr. Spellman said, we'll have books for sale upstairs, and we'll also be taking names down if you'd like us to order a book for you, and we'll call you when it comes in. Please become members. It helps support presentations like this, and you get free admission with every program if you become a member, and we can help you out with that upstairs. Thank you again, Dr. Spellman, and everyone have a good evening.